I love how direct the disciples are in our gospel reading for today. Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. I'm guessing that many of us have had similar thoughts. In essence, we want our way and we want God to make it happen. Have you ever thought that secretly? Yeah. Here, the disciples are actually saying it. Just kind of refreshing. I think sometimes we forget what the world was like for the disciples, for all Jewish people under Roman occupation. They were a religious minority. They worshiped Yahweh when they were expected to worship the emperor. They were a ragtag group living in an occupied territory, policed by Roman soldiers. They were vulnerable to the whims of those in power. Some Jewish people of the time chose to ally with Rome to make their lives easier. Others tried to kind of fly under the radar and not be noticed. Because dissidents, revolutionaries, were arrested, and some were beaten and crucified. This is the context in which the disciples are wanting these divine promises from Jesus, that they have their own way, that he will guarantee that eventually they will be in power at his right hand and left hand. They are sick of feeling small, of being vulnerable, of suffering again and again. As you know, for much of history, Jewish people have felt small, been vulnerable, and have suffered greatly. These ones, known as God's chosen people, have been, and here's a little review of history, have been slaves in Egypt, have wandered in the wilderness. They had a brief, idealized monarchy. Then they were embattled in civil war, overtaken by military powers of Syria, Babylonia, Persia, Greece, Rome. To say the least, it's been rough for these people of God. It brings to mind what St. Teresa of Avila is reported to have said to God once. If this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few. The suffering servant in Isaiah 53, our first reading for today, is Israel. Not one person, but a group of people, the nation of Israel. To help us read it this way and to avoid, for at least today, imposing Christian theology on this Jewish text, I changed the pronouns in this reading from singular to plural. So where it said he, as in like one individual, I wrote they. So I took some liberties there. So instead of he was oppressed and he was afflicted, they were oppressed. They were afflicted. By a perversion of justice, they were taken away. Who could have imagined their future? For they were cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. This scriptural text is referring to the forced removal of the Jewish people from their land during the Babylonian exile. This group is the suffering servant, who were given the role of scapegoat and treated cruelly. Of course, history repeats itself, because as I read this reading again and again this week, I couldn't help but think of the Holocaust, in which the Jewish people were again scapegoated, rounded up, shipped out, and killed, like sheep led to the slaughter. What does it say about God that God's chosen people have suffered in this way? What does it say about God that God's chosen people have suffered in this way? And to bring it a little closer to home for us Christians who have this image of Jesus on a cross, what does it say about God that God's Son suffered as he did? What does it say about God that God's Son suffered as he did? In the 4th century, Constantine married the fledgling Christianity to empire, which meant that Christians gained political power that they had previously did not know. Power is seductive, it is helpful, and Christians got used to having power, exerting control. They got used to winning. In light of that, I think it's very interesting to read Jesus' words in the gospel reading for today. You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers, lord it over them. And their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. It is not so among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. The disciples are tired of being the underdog, small, vulnerable, suffering. And what is Jesus' response to this? That is who you are. That is who God's people are. They choose service among instead of power over. They choose compassion among instead of power over. They choose justice among instead of power over. They choose love among instead of power over. I have a theory that if you're not willing to serve, if you're not willing to suffer, then there's a good chance that you'll become the tyrant with power over. you'll become the bully. And that's not you. You are God's beloved child. You belong to a God who chooses service among instead of power over. Compassion among instead of power over. Our God chooses justice among instead of power over. Love among us instead of power over us. You belong to a God who is willing to suffer. And you are invited to follow. Amen.